Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. Europe is confronting what the EU's Defense Commissioner has described as a perfect storm of security challenges: rising Russian aggression, doubts over U.S. military support, and urgent calls for Europe to boost its defense capabilities. In order to understand what all that means, we'll unpack the complexities of Europe's security future, exploring the financial costs, the industrial hurdles, and political will needed to transform its defense posture. Joining us to discuss it all is Scott Lucas, professor at University College Dublin. Good to have you on the program.
Very good to be here. Thanks to you and your viewers.
Scott, let's start with this idea, this U.S. withdrawal. Now, we've heard this before. How realistic is this? And if it does happen, what are the security implications for Europe?
I think you have to break down the U.S. position, especially with the chaos of the Trump administration, by levels. There's one level, which is the level of Donald Trump himself. And that is that Donald Trump, I think, is unprecedented as a U.S. president because he not only has no interest in European security as such, his priority is not even American national security. He's just a transactional president who's interested in what Donald Trump can get out of the office. We saw this during Trump's first term, when, of course, he would come over to summits, when he would insult allies, especially Germany, when he would threaten to pull out of NATO. And that's continuing in Trump 2.0. You then have another level of officials who I think are quite serious about disengaging the United States from Europe, about at least pulling back from Europe and possibly walking away altogether. And that includes the Vice President J.D. Vance, for example, if you think about the notorious speech back in February at the Munich Security Conference. But you then have a level of officials who very much see that the U.S. is still part of European security. That includes the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, although he's trying to balance all sides. It includes Donald Trump's envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. And I think most importantly, you have American institutions that are still tied to European security. This is a relationship that goes back to the end of World War II. So you have an American military that's tied into Europe, of course, through NATO, as well as through bilateral relationships. You have a U.S. intelligence community that's linked up with European partners. You have U.S. financial institutions that are very much tied into the future of Europe as it develops financially and economically. So I don't think you're looking at a full U.S. withdrawal because of those institutional links. And indeed, in one of those steps that don't get headlines, because it's not a Trump tweet, it's not a crazed statement like he made last week alongside Chancellor Merz of Germany, the U.S. has just made the new appointment for their top commander in Europe, and therefore the top commander in NATO. They're not going to leave that post vacant or let it go to the Europeans. So that's sort of a sign that the Americans do have a level of commitment that does continue despite the damage that Trump has caused.
Mm-hmm. Different levels, you said, different people in the administration, but still ultimately a tie-in to Europe with security that isn't going anywhere. Let's also talk about, you mentioned transactional. This is something that we often associate with Donald Trump when it comes to many, many aspects of what he's doing, defense included. Looking at that 5% target, we have that NATO summit coming up as well. I mean, the Europeans are stepping forward. They're committed to more money, but jumping to that 5% on all allies, that's a big cost. Like, how do you think, can Europe seriously ramp this up this fast without having that political cost or that economic cost for European economies? What Trump wants here, the 5%.
No. Yeah, but that 5% declaration, which is being put out, of course, by the Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth this past week, that's a symbolic marker in terms of the Trump folks saying, oh, we used to say 2%, now we say 5%. Let's talk about the reality of where we are and the reality of European statements that are far more important. That is that most European states were already stepping up their investment in defense because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, some of them had not yet even gotten to the 2% threshold. You look at a state like Spain, for example, but they were on an upward trajectory. Those states that have reached 2%, I think you're talking about, we're going to move to 3%, we're going to move to 3.5%. The UK has made that commitment in the last week. But I think realistically, what you talk about is that their stated spending in defense will probably be around the 3 to 3.5% level, and then there will be other investment in national projects or regional projects such as infrastructure, which can be for both civilian use and for military use. Think about roads, think about logistics, think about engineering projects. So you won't get a 5% headline, but in effect, you will get a significant increase because the real statement that's the target is the one that Ursula von der Leyen put out uh, as the European Commission president a few months ago, which is, will Europe invest 800 billion euros over 5 years in defense production, in investment, especially building up facilities such as those in Western Ukraine? That statement by von der Leyen came as Germany lifted its historic debt brake, which means the Germans will be making a big investment in defense lines. And I think other countries, including the Baltic states, for example, and indeed Poland will be as well. So you're going to see Europe not at the headline level of the 5%, but in reality stepping up what they're doing. The question is it quick enough for Ukraine security? And then you talk about down the line, will it safeguard Europe as you face a Russia that will continue to be aggressive and pursue hybrid warfare as long as Vladimir Putin is still around?
Mm-hmm. Scott, also looking at, I think that autonomy, we hear this as well. Can Europe stand on its own 2 feet? A lot of that is still tied in with the United States, many of these countries, including Poland as well. A lot of that tied with investments into and reliance on military hardware from the United States. I mean, you mentioned that big ramp up. The European Union said, yes, we're going to be doing this. We want to push this more. That all takes time. The defense industry has been lagging behind in many countries in Europe. So I'm just wondering as well, can Europe ever really have that autonomy that is so desired by some? Will there inevitably always be a tie-in to the United States? I mean, looking at Taurus, for instance, I think one expert told me once, like, okay, we have Taurus, we could send them to Ukraine, but inevitably we need the intel from the Americans to make them effective in Ukraine. So can that autonomy really and realistically ever be carried out by Europe on defense?
Yeah, autonomy is not a complete cutoff with the Americans. I mean, it's mistakenly presented that way as such. What autonomy means is that you're able to make decisions as the European Union over your strategic priorities, over your immediate steps you need to take. For example, if you're facing the Russian threat, and then you work with the Americans on those priorities. Some of those priorities will be shared with the Americans. Some of them will be distinctly European priorities. Now, as we mentioned at the start of the interview, I don't foresee a complete U.S. divorce from European security. I do think there will be a constrained U.S. involvement as long as you have a Trump administration. So what you have to do is to pursue that autonomy while maintaining your relations with the adults in the room back in the United States. So it's not an all or nothing question. You ramp up your investment, you ramp up your production, you hold those discussions in NATO in terms of both your tactical and strategic planning. Those discussions will include the Americans. You also are not typically discussing, the heavy frontline, armor. You're not discussing just the warplanes, as you mentioned. You're discussing the new forms of warfare. You're discussing cyber warfare. You're discussing information warfare. In other words, you continue to keep the channels open to the Americans. You maintain the discussions, but yes, you take more responsibility for your defense, which is something we've been saying for many years the Europeans should be doing, even if a lot of European politicians weren't taking up that challenge.
Mm-hmm. And also looking at what Europe is doing well, I mean, where do you see the sectors of defense? Talking about scale and industry, is it naval? Is it air? Is it land? Cyber? Where is the biggest shortfall in Europe at the moment? Where are they doing things well? How do you assess all that going forward in the near future?
Well, I think you can talk about challenges in every sector that need to be taken. For example, you've referred to the question of air power. When you talk about warplanes and when you talk about missiles, the fact is that the Americans have provided most of the aerial capability, the advanced aerial capability that has covered Europe for decades. Europe needs now to seriously step up, both in terms of warplanes and missiles, the possibilities of production. As we saw with the question of just simply ammunition for Ukraine, where Europe set a target but then could not meet it for many, many months. Europe needs to step up basic defense production in terms of munitions. When you talk about, for example, the question of logistics and coordination amongst European forces. Europe needs to do this not just as a NATO priority, it needs to do it between European troops as well. And you need, for example, to not only be able to identify the cyber threat, you need to be able to develop systems of cyber resilience, of cyber defense, and indeed even cyber counterattack against the Russians. So, there are challenges which abound because 21st century is developing so quickly. And I should also add maritime security is a serious issue given the step up of Russian operations. I say this from a country which is outside NATO, which is very much threatened by this, Ireland, which only spends 0.3% of its GDP on defense. So you've got all those challenges across. What I can tell you is I think what we've seen since 2022 is a recognition. There's a recognition that Europe can't just sit on its hands. And as I said about Ukraine, and I'll apply it to European defense as well, this is a marathon, not a sprint. This is not going to be solved in 6 months. It's not going to be solved in a year, but you have to have the sustained commitment where Europe in 2025 says, yeah, we've got to have this challenge. And then in 2026 doesn't go back to sleep and say, well, maybe we can rest easy because perhaps the Russian invasion has been curbed in Ukraine.
Yeah. So it's an interesting analogy, a marathon, not a sprint. Defense as something that is a continued effort for all of us. Look, we'll close it there. Scott, Lucas, always as ever, thank you so much for that and all that during that conversation. And thank you for watching. That concludes this World Talks, but there's much more coming up right here on DVP World, so stay tuned. Goodbye.